If someone tells you that compassion has to wait for permission, they're about to make the biggest mistake of their life. Ethan Carter never imagined that a quiet Tuesday morning would become the day his entire neighborhood questioned everything they believed about authority. The sun had barely climbed above the rooftops when he stepped outside with a travel mug of coffee, expecting nothing more exciting than another drive to work. Instead, a sharp cry carried across the peaceful subdivision, followed by hurried voices that instantly erased the calm. Ethan turned toward the sound and spotted his elderly neighbor's daughter waving frantically from the front porch nearly 2 blocks away. She wasn't screaming in panic anymore. She was pleading for help with the desperate urgency that only comes when every passing second feels heavier than the last. Ethan dropped his coffee onto the lawn and sprinted toward her without hesitation. As he reached the sidewalk, she gasped that her father had suddenly become unresponsive and the paramedics were on their way. But the quickest entrance through the private emergency access gate would save precious time. Ethan didn't waste another second. He raced toward the electronically controlled gate located at the edge of the community, knowing that opening it would allow the ambulance to avoid a long detour through traffic. His heartbeat matched his pace as he reached the keypad, only to stop short. Standing directly in front of the control panel with her arms folded was Linda Brooks, president of the Homeowners Association. She calmly held a ring of keys while watching Ethan approach. "Move," Ethan said, struggling to keep his voice steady. "The ambulance needs this entrance." Linda barely blinked. "This gate stays locked unless proper authorization is filed." Ethan stared at her, convinced she had misunderstood. "This is an emergency. The rules don't change because people get emotional," Linda answered evenly. Ethan glanced toward the street beyond the gate, where distant sirens had begun echoing through the neighborhood. Every instinct told him to find another solution, but every alternate route added valuable minutes. "Open the gate," he repeated. "Now." Linda shook her head with complete confidence. "If I make one exception today, every resident will expect exceptions tomorrow." A few nearby homeowners stepped onto their driveways after hearing the conversation. Some exchanged confused looks, while others quietly pulled out their phones. No one interrupted. No one seemed willing to challenge the woman who had spent years reminding everyone that community rules existed for a reason. Ethan looked from Linda to the approaching intersection, calculating distances in his mind. The ambulance would have to circle almost a mile around the subdivision before reaching the house. He could already picture the unnecessary delay. "You'll regret this," he said quietly. Linda answered with a composed smile that somehow made the moment even colder. Following the rules is never something to regret. At that exact moment, the distant sirens grew louder, and every neighbor standing nearby realized they were about to witness a decision that would change the entire community forever. The sirens grew louder until the flashing lights finally appeared at the far entrance of the subdivision, exactly where Ethan had feared they would. Instead of reaching the nearest access point, the ambulance slowed, turned, and disappeared behind a row of houses to follow the much longer route around the neighborhood. Ethan looked back at Linda in disbelief. She remained perfectly still beside the locked gate, as though nothing unusual was happening. A heavy silence settled over the small crowd gathering along the sidewalk. One neighbor quietly whispered, "They have to drive almost another mile now." Another shook his head, but said nothing. Ethan pulled out his phone and quickly waved down the elderly neighbor's daughter, who was still standing near the porch with visible worry on her face. "Tell them to stay on the line with emergency dispatch," he called. "I am heading over on foot." Without waiting for another response, he sprinted across a narrow walking path that connected several backyards, searching for the fastest route available to reach the house before the ambulance arrived. As he ran, more residents stepped outside after hearing the approaching sirens. Curious faces appeared behind windows. Garage doors opened. A woman walking her dog stopped and stared toward the locked gate, where Linda still stood with her keys in hand. Several people began asking one another why the emergency entrance had not been opened. No one seemed to receive an answer. Ethan reached the house breathing hard. The family was doing everything emergency dispatch had instructed while anxiously watching for the ambulance. He immediately offered reassurance, helped clear the front entryway, and looked down the street again. Every passing second seemed longer than the last. Finally, the ambulance rounded the distant corner and carefully pulled to the curb. The responders moved quickly and professionally, bringing equipment toward the front door without hesitation. One of them briefly glanced back toward the direction of the locked shortcut before continuing inside. Ethan noticed the expression but did not interrupt their work. His attention remained on supporting the family in every calm and practical way possible. Outside, neighbors continued arriving in small groups. Conversations grew louder. "Why was the gate closed?" someone asked. "I thought it was there for emergencies," another replied. A teenager quietly admitted that he had recorded part of the exchange from across the street because he thought the argument looked unusual. An older resident mentioned that her security camera pointed directly toward the entrance. Another neighbor realized his dashboard camera had been running while he waited to leave for work. None of them fully understood how important those recordings might become. Across the subdivision, Linda finally walked away from the gate with the same measured confidence she had displayed earlier. She greeted a board member who had just arrived and calmly explained that she had simply enforced established community policies. She believed the discussion would end there because, in her mind, rules had been followed exactly as written. She never noticed that nearly every conversation around her had already shifted away from the emergency itself and toward one unsettling question that spread from driveway to driveway faster than any official announcement ever could. If opening the gate had been possible all along, why had someone decided not to do it? By late afternoon, the neighborhood no longer felt like the quiet community Ethan had known for years. Small conversations formed on sidewalks, at mailboxes, and across driveways, each one beginning with the same uncertain question before quickly turning into quiet disagreement. Some residents insisted that Linda had only done what every board president was expected to do by following written policies exactly. Others could not understand why common sense had disappeared at the very moment it mattered most. Ethan had no interest in winning an argument. After making sure his neighbor's family had everything they needed, he returned home exhausted, hoping the situation would settle on its own. Instead, his phone began vibrating almost immediately. Text messages from neighbors arrived one after another. One resident asked if he was willing to explain what had happened because the story was already changing depending on who was telling it. Another said Linda had been informing people that Ethan had become aggressive and demanded special treatment instead of respecting community procedures. Ethan read every message carefully before putting the phone down. He knew that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. Across the neighborhood, Linda continued speaking confidently with anyone who approached her. She repeated that emergency responders had still reached the property and that established rules existed to protect every homeowner equally. According to her version of events, opening a secured entrance without formal authorization could have created liability for the association. Her explanation sounded organized and professional enough that several longtime supporters nodded in agreement. They believed experience mattered more than emotion. Yet each time Linda repeated the story, another resident quietly mentioned seeing something that did not seem to match her account. One neighbor remembered Ethan asking calmly several times before raising his voice. Another recalled Linda standing beside the control panel with the keys already in her hand. A retired teacher admitted she had watched the entire exchange from her front porch and never once felt that Ethan had been disrespectful. As evening approached, more unexpected details surfaced. The teenager who had recorded part of the confrontation showed a short clip to his parents. Although the video covered only a few moments, it clearly captured Ethan asking for the gate to be opened while the sirens echoed in the distance. His parents encouraged him not to post it online, but to save the original file instead. At nearly the same time, another homeowner checked the recordings from a doorbell camera facing the entrance road. The camera had captured vehicles stopping as neighbors watched the conversation unfold. Even without sound, the timeline appeared important. Meanwhile, a delivery driver contacted one of the residents after realizing that his dashboard camera had also been recording while he waited near the gate. None of these people coordinated with one another. They simply felt uneasy enough to preserve what they had. Ethan remained unaware that evidence was quietly accumulating from multiple directions. He spent the evening answering concerned neighbors with the same response every time. He said the focus should remain on helping the family recover and making sure something similar never happened again. That calm attitude surprised many residents who expected him to attack the board publicly. Instead, His restraint caused even more people to question why Linda seemed determined to defend every decision rather than acknowledge that the situation deserved honest reflection. Before the sun disappeared completely, word spread that the next homeowners association meeting would be unusually crowded. People who had never attended a board meeting before were already making plans to be there. And for the first time since Linda became president, she was about to face a room filled with neighbors who wanted answers instead of reminders about the rules. The following morning, the neighborhood seemed unusually quiet, but beneath that silence, dozens of residents were doing the same thing without realizing it. They were reviewing security recordings from the previous day. What had started as scattered curiosity slowly became a careful reconstruction of the entire timeline. Ethan was loading supplies into his truck for work when his phone rang again. This time it was the retired teacher from across the street. She asked if he could stop by for just a minute because she had found something on her porch camera. Ethan hesitated before agreeing, still hoping the situation would not become even larger than it already was. When he arrived, she showed him the recording. The angle was wide, capturing the entrance gate, several nearby homes, and the street leading toward the emergency access point. Although the audio was faint, the video clearly showed Linda standing beside the control panel long before Ethan reached the gate. It also showed that she never appeared confused about how the system worked. She remained beside the controls the entire time. Ethan thanked her but made no comment. Before leaving, he simply asked her to keep the original recording safe. Less than an hour later, another resident contacted him with footage from a doorbell camera facing the opposite direction. This recording filled in several missing minutes and confirmed that the ambulance had approached the community exactly as expected before turning away toward the longer entrance. The timestamps matched perfectly. By lunchtime, a delivery driver who visited the neighborhood almost every weekday remembered that his dashboard camera had remained active while he waited behind another vehicle near the entrance. Curious after hearing neighbors discuss the incident, he reviewed the file and discovered several uninterrupted minutes that showed vehicles stopped while the conversation unfolded. He voluntarily offered a copy to anyone conducting a factual review. Meanwhile, Linda believed the controversy was beginning to fade. She sent a brief community email reminding residents that board members were expected to enforce governing documents consistently and thanked those who supported orderly procedures. Instead of calming the neighborhood, the message had the opposite effect. Residents who had remained undecided now began comparing the email with the growing collection of recordings. The words sounded polished, but the visual evidence seemed to tell a more complicated story. Throughout the afternoon, neighbors quietly visited one another carrying flash drives, memory cards, and laptop computers. No one edited the recordings. No one added commentary. They simply compared timestamps and camera angles until the sequence became surprisingly clear. Ethan appeared calm from beginning to end. Linda never appeared uncertain about controlling the gate. The ambulance unmistakably changed direction after finding the entrance unavailable. Even small details matched across multiple recordings, making it difficult for anyone to dismiss the timeline as incomplete. Ethan still refused every suggestion that the videos should immediately appear on social media. He reminded everyone that facts should come before opinions and that public arguments often buried the truth instead of revealing it. His restraint impressed neighbors who barely knew him before this week. By sunset, another unexpected development arrived. One of the Homeowners Association board members privately contacted Ethan and admitted that several directors had never been told exactly what happened at the gate. They had only heard Linda's summary during a brief phone call. After learning that multiple recordings existed, the board member quietly asked whether the complete timeline could be presented before the upcoming meeting. Ethan agreed without hesitation because he believed the evidence should speak for itself. And for the first time since the incident began, the balance of the entire situation started shifting away from confident explanations and toward undeniable facts. By the end of the week, the conversation had spread beyond driveways and front porches into nearly every corner of the community. What had begun as a disagreement over a single decision was now becoming a serious question about leadership itself. Ethan continued living his normal routine, leaving for work every morning and checking on his elderly neighbor each evening, who was thankfully recovering well enough to return home with family support. The good news lifted everyone's spirits. but it also made residents think even more about how differently the day could have unfolded. Meanwhile, Linda remained convinced that the growing criticism was based on emotion rather than facts. She spoke confidently with several homeowners, repeating that the emergency responders had ultimately arrived and that the association could not allow individual residents to override established procedures whenever they felt it was necessary. She believed that consistency protected the community. Unfortunately for her, every explanation created another opening for someone to compare her words with the expanding collection of recordings. During one conversation outside the clubhouse, a homeowner politely asked why she had not simply contacted another board member before refusing access. Linda answered that there had not been enough time. Moments later, another resident quietly reminded everyone that she had remained standing at the gate for several minutes while speaking with Ethan. The discussion ended awkwardly, leaving several longtime supporters exchanging uncertain glances. Later that afternoon, one of the association directors requested an informal meeting with the rest of the board before the scheduled community session. Several members had now reviewed portions of the available recordings. None of them openly accused Linda of wrongdoing, but they agreed that they needed to understand the complete timeline before addressing concerned homeowners. Linda arrived expecting an easy conversation. Instead, one director placed a printed timeline on the conference table showing when the first emergency call had been placed, when Ethan reached the gate, when the ambulance changed direction, and when responders finally arrived at the home. The timestamps matched multiple independent recordings. Linda immediately argued that the timeline ignored the importance of following established policy. Another director calmly responded that the question was no longer whether policies existed. The question was whether those policies had actually prevented someone from making a reasonable decision during an extraordinary situation. Linda insisted that making exceptions would create confusion for future board members. No one answered immediately. The silence around the table said more than any argument could have. Outside the meeting room, residents continued sharing information respectfully rather than emotionally. Instead of posting dramatic accusations online, they exchanged original files, written observations, and contact information for anyone willing to verify events personally. Ethan was invited to attend the upcoming board meeting, but declined to prepare any speech. He simply organized the recordings in chronological order and labeled each file with the time it had been captured. He wanted facts to remain separate from opinions. That quiet approach impressed even people who had initially sided with Linda. They expected confrontation but found patience instead. As evenings settled over the neighborhood, another unexpected witness stepped forward. A maintenance contractor who serviced the community gates contacted a board member after hearing about the incident. He explained that he had inspected the emergency access system only days before and remembered its operating condition clearly. He also mentioned something that immediately changed the atmosphere inside the board. According to his maintenance records, the gate had been fully operational that morning, and opening it manually would have required only a few simple seconds. The room fell completely silent because everyone suddenly understood that the next community meeting would no longer be about opinions. It would be about choices. The community meeting began nearly 30 minutes before its scheduled start, because residents filled every available chair inside the clubhouse and continued gathering along the walls. Some homeowners who had never attended a single association meeting arrived carrying notebooks, while others quietly held flash drives containing copies of the recordings they had collected throughout the week. Ethan entered without drawing attention to himself and took a seat near the back of the room. He had no intention of making emotional speeches. He simply brought the organized timeline and original files in case anyone asked to review them. Linda walked confidently to the front table beside the other board members. Although she greeted several familiar faces with polite smiles, she immediately noticed that the atmosphere felt different. Instead of casual conversations about landscaping or neighborhood maintenance, the room remained unusually quiet. Every person seemed focused on the same unanswered question. The board president opened the meeting with routine announcements, but before she could move to the next agenda item, another director respectfully interrupted and suggested addressing the recent incident first because it had become the community's primary concern. Linda hesitated for only a moment before agreeing. She stood and calmly repeated the explanation she had shared all week. She stated that she had followed association procedures consistently, that emergency responders eventually reached the property, and that board members could not ignore established policies whenever residents requested exceptions. When she finished, only silence followed. Then one homeowner slowly raised her hand and asked whether the emergency access gate had been fully functional at the time. Linda answered yes. Another resident asked whether the keys had been in her possession during the entire encounter. Linda again answered yes. A third homeowner quietly asked whether opening the gate would have required only a few seconds. Before Linda could respond, the maintenance contractor who had been invited to attend stood and introduced himself. He explained that he serviced the gate regularly and confirmed that it had been operating normally just days before the incident. According to his inspection records, both the electronic control and manual override were fully functional. The room grew noticeably quieter. One board member then asked Ethan whether he was willing to present the collected timeline. Ethan walked to the front carrying a small folder and connected a laptop to the meeting room display. Without adding opinions or dramatic commentary, he played the recordings in chronological order. One camera showed Linda waiting beside the control panel. Another showed Ethan requesting that the gate be opened while distant sirens approached. A third recording captured the ambulance turning away toward the longer entrance. The dashboard camera completed the sequence by confirming the timing from a different angle. Each timestamp aligned with the next until the entire event unfolded before everyone exactly as it had happened. No one interrupted the presentation. When the final video ended, the board members compared the recordings with the printed timeline and quietly verified every minute. One director finally looked toward Linda and asked a simple question. Knowing what you know now, would you make the same decision again? Linda looked around the crowded room. For the first time all evening, she did not answer immediately. The confidence that had carried her through every previous conversation seemed to fade beneath the weight of the evidence. Residents were no longer debating rumors or relying on conflicting memories. They had watched the complete sequence together. At that moment, another board member announced that the association would begin a formal review of its emergency access procedures and leadership decisions related to the incident. The room remained calm, but everyone understood that the discussion had crossed an important line. This was no longer about defending policies. It had become an honest examination of responsibility, and the truth was only beginning to reshape the future of the entire neighborhood. The formal review began the very next morning, and the atmosphere throughout the neighborhood changed almost immediately. Instead of debating what might have happened, the board members focused entirely on verified facts. Every recording was copied directly from its original source. Every timestamp was compared, and every witness was invited to describe only what they had personally seen. Ethan answered each question calmly and briefly, refusing to speculate about anyone's intentions. He explained exactly where he had been standing, exactly what he had requested, and exactly what happened after the ambulance turned toward the longer entrance. His consistency impressed everyone involved because his account matched every available recording without contradiction. Linda also met with the review committee. She maintained that she had acted according to the governing documents and insisted that consistency had guided every decision she made. However, when board members compared her statements with the maintenance records, security footage, and witness observations, several important details no longer aligned. One director quietly asked why she had never contacted emergency dispatch or another board member before refusing access. Linda admitted that she had made the decision herself because she believed there was no time for discussion. Another director pointed out that the recordings showed several minutes passing while she remained beside the gate. The room fell silent again. No one accused her of acting with bad intentions, but it became increasingly difficult to explain why additional options had never been considered. Later that afternoon, the review committee received one final piece of information from the emergency response supervisor who had responded that day. He did not criticize anyone personally. Instead, he simply confirmed the travel route shown in the recordings and explained that responders always preferred the closest available entrance whenever it could be accessed safely. His statement matched the reconstructed timeline exactly. By the end of the meeting, every independent source supported the same sequence of events. The conclusion was impossible to ignore. The emergency entrance had been available. The gate had been operational. The keys had been present. The decision not to open it had been a personal judgment rather than a technical limitation. News of those findings spread through the neighborhood before sunset. Residents who had defended Linda from the beginning began reconsidering their position. Several even visited Ethan to apologize for assuming he had exaggerated the situation. Ethan accepted every apology with quiet appreciation and reminded them that the purpose of the review was never to embarrass anyone. He only wanted the community to learn from what had happened so that no family would ever face the same obstacle again. His response surprised many people because they expected anger after everything that had occurred. Instead, they saw restraint and empathy. That contrast became impossible to overlook. Meanwhile, Linda walked through the neighborhood almost unnoticed. Homeowners who normally greeted her warmly now exchanged only brief nods before continuing their conversations. She realized that authority built over many years had begun disappearing within a single week, not because of rumors, but because the evidence had spoken more clearly than any speech ever could. At the board's request, an emergency meeting was officially scheduled for all homeowners to vote on immediate policy changes and discuss leadership accountability. As notices appeared on every community mailbox, residents understood that the next gathering would not simply determine new procedures. It would decide what kind of neighborhood they wanted to become and whether trust, once broken, could finally be rebuilt. The emergency community meeting attracted more residents than any gathering in the association's history. Folding chairs filled every available space inside the clubhouse, and homeowners stood quietly along the walls waiting for the discussion to begin. Unlike previous meetings, there were no casual conversations about landscaping or neighborhood improvements. Everyone had come for one reason. The board chair opened the session by summarizing the findings from the formal review. The reconstructed timeline, the maintenance records, the security footage, the witness statements, and the emergency response supervisor's comments all pointed to the same conclusion. The emergency access gate had been fully functional, and opening it had been possible within seconds. No one challenged those facts because every resident had already been given the opportunity to review the original evidence. Linda listened without interruption, her expression far more restrained than it had been only days earlier. When invited to speak, she stood slowly and admitted that she believed she had been protecting the association by applying its rules consistently. She explained that she feared setting a precedent that future residents might misuse. Several people listened respectfully, but the room remained silent after she finished. Finally, an elderly homeowner stood and quietly said, "Rules exist to protect people. They do not replace judgment." His words were simple, yet they echoed through the room more powerfully than any long speech could have. One by one, other residents shared similar thoughts. None of them attacked Linda personally. Instead, they described how the incident had changed their understanding of leadership. They wanted board members who could follow policies while also recognizing extraordinary circumstances. They wanted procedures that supported common sense instead of preventing it. Ethan remained seated through the entire discussion until one director asked whether he wished to address the community. He walked to the front, thanked every resident who had contributed evidence, and reminded everyone that the neighborhood had solved the problem because people chose facts over assumptions. He said the goal had never been to defeat anyone or embarrass a volunteer. The real victory would be making certain that every future emergency received the fastest possible response. His calm words shifted the atmosphere even further. Residents who had entered the meeting expecting confrontation instead found themselves united around practical solutions. The board then presented a package of immediate policy changes. Every emergency access point would remain available to first responders without unnecessary delay. Clear written procedures would allow designated board members and trained volunteers to authorize emergency entry whenever public safety required it. Annual emergency preparedness training would become part of the association's responsibilities, and every homeowner would receive updated information about those procedures. The proposals were approved by an overwhelming vote. Immediately afterward, another motion was introduced requesting a leadership election at the earliest date permitted under the governing documents. The discussion remained respectful, but the result was decisive. The community had lost confidence in Linda's ability to lead after the review established that better judgment had been possible. As the meeting ended, neighbors who had rarely spoken before exchanged handshakes and quiet conversations about rebuilding trust. Outside, the evening air felt lighter than it had all week. Ethan walked toward the parking lot expecting to leave unnoticed, but several families stopped to thank him for remaining patient when it would have been much easier to become angry. Looking back at the brightly lit clubhouse, he realized the neighborhood had changed forever, not because one person had lost authority, but because an entire community had chosen compassion and accountability over fear and rigid control. Over the following weeks, the neighborhood slowly settled into a new routine, but it no longer felt like the same place Ethan Carter had known before that unforgettable morning. The special election took place exactly as the governing documents required, and a new group of board members was chosen with one clear promise. Every future decision would place the well-being of residents alongside the community rules instead of treating those two ideas as opposites. The first changes appeared almost immediately. Bright reflective signs were installed at every emergency entrance explaining the updated procedures. Volunteers attended safety workshops alongside board members, and the local emergency response team was invited to review the new access plan so everyone understood exactly how it would work if another urgent situation ever occurred. Residents who had rarely spoken to one another before now greeted each other more often, sharing ideas about improving the neighborhood instead of arguing about policies. Ethan never expected any special recognition for what he had done. In fact, he quietly returned to his normal schedule as soon as everything settled. He went back to work each morning, helped neighbors whenever they needed an extra hand, and visited the elderly homeowner from time to time. The man continued recovering well, and every visit ended with a grateful smile that reminded Ethan why he had acted without hesitation that day. Those simple moments meant far more to him than public praise ever could. Linda remained in the neighborhood for a while after stepping away from leadership. She no longer carried the confidence that once accompanied every board meeting, but she also experienced something unexpected. Several residents who had disagreed with her still greeted her politely. They believed accountability did not require cruelty. Over time, she quietly acknowledged that she had focused so completely on enforcing policies that she had failed to recognize the importance of flexibility during extraordinary circumstances. Although rebuilding trust would take much longer than losing it, that small admission became the first step toward healing. One sunny Saturday, the community gathered for a neighborhood picnic organized by the newly elected board. Children played on the grass while families shared homemade food under rows of shaded tables. Near the entrance stood the updated emergency gate, now tested regularly and clearly marked with instructions that everyone could understand. During the event, the new board president thanked every resident who had contributed recordings, witness statements, and thoughtful ideas during the review. Instead of celebrating one individual, the speech praised the entire community for choosing honesty over assumptions and cooperation over division. Ethan stood near the back of the crowd holding a paper cup of lemonade, smiling quietly as neighbors enjoyed the afternoon together. No cameras recorded the moment. No dramatic speeches followed. There was only the comforting feeling that the neighborhood had become stronger because ordinary people refused to ignore an important lesson. Rules could organize a community, but compassion gave those rules their purpose. As the sun began to set behind the familiar rooftops, families slowly packed their chairs and walked home along peaceful sidewalks. The same streets that had once witnessed confusion and disagreement now reflected something entirely different. They reflected trust earned through truth, leadership shaped by humility, and neighbors who understood that the strongest communities were built not by rigid authority, but by people willing to help one another when every second mattered.